So, drama on the US border. Donald Trump continues to have trouble with the law and closing in on the debt limit deadline. It's a busy time in the United States. Joining me live is Professor of Political Science at Cyprus College, Peter Mathews. Peter, we've heard lots this week about the expiry of the Title 42 border regulation in the US. What exactly is it and what changes now?
Title 42 was put in place during the COVID pandemic in order to make sure that people didn't come across and then bring in a lot of COVID to the United States. So it was very strictly enforced. It was very difficult for people to come in here and apply for asylum. And this time now it was expired yesterday, last night actually, and Title 8 took its place. Title 8 allows people to apply for asylum, but they have to do it either online or actually get an appointment rather through looking at an app, or they also cannot apply for it if they have come through another country. They have to apply in the country that they first get to from their own country first. So it makes it harder to apply for asylum, but it does allow them to do so, and they get a hearing in the United States. So it's quite a problem, but this whole thing begins with big macroeconomic problems with free trade, like the NAFTA free trade agreement, which I believe really ended up hurting Mexico and the United States working class and middle class. And it encouraged more people to come here because they lost their jobs in Mexico, or they were paid very low wages by companies that went in there. And we can discuss that in detail in just a bit if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, how big a problem is the southern border? Because Donald Trump, the former president, was talking about a wall that many people sort of thought would never be built, and it hasn't been. But, you know, how big an issue is it? And is there any light at the end of the tunnel?
It is an issue, but the thing is, a wall is not going to stop the immigration because of the macroeconomic policies, as I said. With free trade, with not ensuring that there are higher wages in Mexico before we let Mexico into the NAFTA agreement, will people start coming across here, because NAFTA also allowed American farmers, agribusiness, to dump their low-priced corn on the Mexican market and drove out Mexican farmers from their farms. Let me give you an example. 2 million Mexican farmers lost their farms in the first several years of NAFTA. 2 million lost their farms. They went to the factories to work in companies like GM, which moved American factories here to Mexico and hired Mexican workers at $1 to $4 an hour, Tim. That's all. They were paying the same workers in the United States to make the same type of trucks, put them together. General Motors, for example, were paying $18 to $32 an hour to American workers here to build the same Silverado truck they were building in Mexico for $1 to $4 an hour. That really increased the poverty level in Mexico more, made people more desperate. There are also Central Americans fleeing Central America, coming through Mexico. And those Central Americans are fleeing Central America because of the corruption and the violence. And quite often, our U.S. foreign policy was not adjusted well enough to be able to help people develop economies down there, in places like Guatemala, for example. Instead, the U.S. took the corporation side, not the worker side. And that was a real problem because it caused a lot of human rights violations, military takeovers, and the U.S. went along with that for a long time. So it's a long compounded problem from 30, 40, 50 years ago. It has to be addressed from the ground up and not just plastered over by some temporary solution. This is a big crisis at this point, of course.
Change of subject. Donald Trump was found liable of sexual abuse and defamation, ordered to pay $5 million this week. Another legal battle for him. Do you think it's ever going to affect him in this 2024 Republican primary field?
Not in the primary so much, although it could slightly with some voters. For example, the evangelical Christians are a big part of the Republican base in the primaries. They're about 40% of the vote. Ron DeSantis, the governor DeSantis, is winning among them by about 7% over Donald Trump in the primary. But overall, the Republican voters in the primaries are overwhelmingly for Trump at this point. He's pulling in 60, 70% of their support over DeSantis, his second place rival. And so he will probably win the primary if things keep going as they are, regardless of how this case came up. We know that he was held liable for sexual assault and battery and defamation against E. Jean Carroll. We know that. He was fined $5 million. In fact, she might have actually go to court again because in his interview on CNN, he started defaming her again, it looks like. So it's still, his people that support him are so loyal, they'll probably vote him in the primaries if things go as they are. And in the general election, he won't be able to win because the American people as a whole do not approve of his behavior or of his policies in many ways.
Oh, you touched on it there, didn't you? He hasn't changed his attitude to so many things, using that town hall with CNN this week to attack his opponents, repeat lies of election fraud, ridicule Ms. Carroll over the charges and suggest he'd pardon the January 6 insurrectionists that he provoked. Is this really a winning strategy long term?
Absolutely not. And he should realize that, although he just wants to win the primary and that he doesn't care what he's doing, he's doubling down on these egregious activities and claims of his to get his base out there to vote during the primaries for him so he can be the nominee. He thinks he can then win in the general election. But the thing about Donald Trump is he might even try to win by claiming in the general election that he actually won when he actually lost, like he did back in 2020. And he's counting on things like that, creating havoc, wreaking, mayhem in the whole system once he wins the primary. And this is the danger. He could destabilize our system in the general election and even post-general election in 2024. That's why we have to be vigilant, to make sure that everyone in America knows his true colors, what he stands for, and how dangerous a candidate he really is. And then I'm really concerned why CNN let him on for so long, for over an hour, to spew much of his lies and create mayhem once again. So that's a problem we should all as Americans take very seriously and try to educate some of the voters who will see that. I think people are pretty much set right now who they're going to vote for in the primaries and the general. But things could change, too, with all these different cases coming up against him. He's got to face legal challenges still. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, regardless of your political colours, if it wasn't true, you wouldn't believe it, to be honest. The United States now is, as we move on to another subject, close to the deadline for raising that debt limit. The Republican-led House has been at a standoff with the White House for some time over this. Will Speaker McCarthy and President Biden reach a compromise, do you think?
This is very serious, Tim. And in fact, we don't know if they'll reach compromise before they need to, which is within the next couple of weeks at the most, because Janet Yellen and even the Congressional Budget Office said that we're going to reach that debt ceiling limit and be out of money completely at the beginning of June. If that happens, if the United States has to default as a result and cannot or will not pay its bills, including the debt interest rate, that's going to be tremendously terribly negatively effective against the United States and the world's economy. You could have thousands of jobs lost. You can have pension funds and thousands of dollars lost to people's pension funds. You can have cuts in the veterans' benefits. There's so many things that would put the country in a terrible situation. Interest rates will probably go way up, and there's a good chance that we could have a great recession again in the next few months if this happens. If we reach this debt ceiling limit on June 8th or so, maybe even sooner, and can't make the payment. Now, what happened was the White House met with the top leaders of Congress just on Monday, and they could not come to agreement. The Republicans still demanding cuts, $130 billion worth of cuts in programs before they will actually raise the debt limit. Democrats saying you've got to raise the debt limit first, let's just do that, and then talk about the budget and discuss and debate the cuts in programs if you want to. But first, and foremost, raise the debt limit because that is something that's in the Constitution. In fact, the 14th Amendment says that the United States debt will always be honored. It will never be questioned. And they were referring to the debt the federal government had to pay in the Civil War. When the costs of the Civil War had to be spent, the money had to be spent. After the war was ended, they still had to pay for it. And Congress or the president are compelled to pay that debt. So that same thing applies today. And it is unconscionable that these two sides are not getting together on this. It has to be done.
I think that figure was around 8 million jobs I read. You just have to flick through the papers and see what could happen. So it is a huge, huge story. Now, just finally, we saw some images there of President Biden. How are his prospects looking? We know he's confirmed he's seeking a second term.
Right. And the latest poll that I saw was about 3 days ago, and that was the YouGov Yahoo poll, which showed him at a couple of points ahead of President Trump. It was 45 to 43. And the DeSantis was 45 to 42. Ron DeSantis against Biden. And President Biden against Trump was 45 to 43. So it's about a couple of point difference. It's very close right now. If the general election were held today, it would be hard to say who would win because that's within the margin of error. And yet we know this is a precarious, very, very important election. And people should really wake up here in America and decide who they vote for based on principles, on issues, and also on the personality and the ability of the candidate to lead this country. This is a huge country, hugely influential country in the world, as you know. The world's #1 economy, has a huge amount of influence economically and socially as well. And we got to have someone worthy of this office. And it doesn't look that great right now for the stability of this country if things keep going as they are. I'm hoping that we all come to our senses and settle this down. The leaders of this country should lead this country truly. Otherwise, we'll have a real catastrophe.
Peter, we'll catch up with you next week.
Thank you, Tim. We will.